This is a continuation of the scrap copper amalgamation project, where I melted down some copper into a little ingot. In this follow-up project, I wanted to make and cast my own copper-based alloy from scrap metal, and then use a lathe to turn it into pulleys, which I would then use in my coursework. So, what, this is the copper alloy making... It's ready to lathe. Sure. Also known as the, let's see here, cam girl? Oh no. Previously, I only had around 60 grams of copper, mostly retrieved from loose wires off of the street. This worked well for the purposes of proving it possible to cast copper with my awful setup, though if I actually wanted to make something useful, I'd need a little more material. I was lucky right off the bat when I discovered some old copper piping from my sink, which had previously been ripped out and replaced. I wanted to get more copper from some dead electronics I'd accumulated. Sadly, a large proportion of modern-day domestic wiring is tinned, or is otherwise more stingy with its copper. Older wires, however, had much more material, like this cable for my XTV. I also found these, and don't I just look so enthused about it? Shame that enthusiasm didn't stick around, huh? Finally, on the way home from school one day, I discovered a crushed and abandoned bit of copper pipe. So naturally, I picked it up, gave it a wash, nursed it back to health, and, as all good guardians do, sawed it into pieces. At this point, I'd accumulated a good 600-ish grams of copper. Because I was going to lathe this, I should probably make it as close to a cylinder as I could get it. Doing the maths, that comes out to be around 95mm long with a 30mm diameter. That'll do. It's nice having all this copper, but it could prove difficult to melt it all in one batch, especially given that I was only allowed to use this one small casting ladle. Cramming all of that in could prove difficult. If it was all contained as nice convenient ingots, however, it would all fit in a lot easier. I made some sandcasts, this time using a pewter ingot I found in the workshop as a pattern instead of a custom 3D printed one like I'd used last time. After that, I set about cutting the pipes with a hacksaw and pipe cutter, the former to remove non-copper parts, the latter to make each piece a length that would fit in the crucible. I then flattened the pipes on an anvil, so they took up as little space as possible. I was really good at this, as I'm sure you can tell. Finally, I fired up the braising hearth and melted the copper. Here are the highlights.
Oh, it's this one, that's right.
Oh, is it? Oh.
Alright, this is going to be a good day.
Attempt 6.
Let's go, boys.
Yay! Oh, I can feel the heat from here.
Yeah. Issue currently is not enough oxygen.
Yeah.
Again.
Also, that is a very hot crucible.
It is pretty hot.
Also, that fire break is not happening.
It was happening a lot faster than last time. Look at that.
There's green fire coming out of the car.
Yeah, I know.
That's so cool.
This might take a little while. Yes, it's bubbling.
That is so cool, honestly.
There's nothing more satisfying than watching copper melt into a bunk.
That works with any method. Yeah, just any blasting.
Well, I don't know. Fuse is pretty lame.
Yeah, because it's just like... I mean, just blasting metal is what would be fun.
Yeah. It's now melting properly.
Oh, good.
Hopefully we should be able to pass it.
Alex, is your face not really hot?
It is a little bit. I mean, this is copper. This is the baby stuff, you know?
What temperature does aluminium melt at?
What?
What temperature does aluminium melt at?
I have no idea. Probably a bit lower than copper.
Yeah.
Wow, that's the best it can do. That's how well it can focus. It is now a very satisfying looking puddle of cotton.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's shining.
I know.
Oh my
it's
God.
glorious. I'm so sorry, Canada. I'll pick this up.
As you can see,
It is soft.
wait Alex, I can actually catch the copper in there. Yeah, I've lowered the brightness all the way down.
No one is missing out on.
Yeah. It's like, no mate, I'm not looking at that. Like, no, it's the sun. I ain't falling for this one.
Oh yeah, it's quite a bit solid there, isn't it?
Yeah.
At some point soon, I think it's probably one to pouring it.
I mean, it did just crumple, so we'll give it another minute or two.
I'll tell you 22 minutes. That's 1 minute 20 seconds.
Okay. Once again, let us celebrate. Well, we have a puddle. Now the ritual of the product. We have a puddle. Get hyped, boys, get hyped. Let's make this as quick as possible.
Yep.
But of course, nothing I ever do is complete without some bad camera.
Oh, that
Still
is
some copper.
that is so on fire. Like,
But I have a steel rod. It won't spit. Yeah, I forgot to warn you, it is very on fire. Safety first. Yeah, go.
oh no.
Okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna put a brick on it. Stop burning! Oh, fuck's sake. As in stop burning.
Not start.
Not, oh my god. Okay, well, it'll be fine.
Give me a thumbs
Oh my
up.
god, that is so hot. That's as good as I can do.
Nice.
Hey!
Oh.
There it is.
Hey.
Oh, fuck's sake. You are the worst birthday cake ever. Right, so the next step, which you have to record a good angle of, because we didn't get it last time, because the Dapper is the worst cameraman in history.
Yep. Ah.
I'm going to tell you what, we're going to move the water so it's closer.
I have a good angle here.
Okay, I'll be very careful not to put my elbow in the shot. Okay, so what we're going to do is just kind of...
Use your drama skills, don't mask it.
Yeah. My elbow got perfectly in the shot last time, it was beautiful.
I got it.
Beautiful. And that is a copper ingot.
Wonderful.
And here's a copper puddle. Equally as cool.
Not really.
Not really.
That paper is gold.
And there's this bit as well. Now introducing all the copper you could ever want. Except that it's nowhere near enough. There we go. And this is very much still smoking. Yeah,
Are we done?
more or less.
As in with the recording. Wow, that is very hot.
This is also pretty warm water. That is, thank you for your camera work, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
And that,
Is that the conclusion to the video?
yes, that, oh my
Don't
god.
forget to like and subscribe, everyone.
Oh, for God's sake. Yeah, there you go. That's some copper.
I got this strange discoloration on the copper when I dumped it into the water really soon after casting. I believe it's oxide. Also, putting this ingot into the water while it's still quite soft enabled some water to get trapped inside the ingot. When I heated it up with an iron, don't ask, you could hear the water boiling internally and see some droplets escape. Lesson learned, let the copper cool in its own time. After 2 sessions at the hearth, I was able to collate all of the copper into just 4 ingots, the combined weight of which was 577 grams. This whole process only cost me 20 grams or so, most of which would have been impurities like limescale in the pipes. Pretty good going, if you ask me. Here's the plan. Simply remelt the metal, add a dash of tin, or in this case some of the pewter I'd used to make the sandcasts. It's mostly tin anyway. And pour. Easy, right? What could go wrong? Well, the copper took forever to melt, should have seen that coming. And as a result, the handle of the crucible got really fucking hot. So I had to find a solution to that. And there was a lot of slag. More on that later. I was actually really surprised by how simple it was to alloy metals. You'd expect to need to stir it or something, but apparently just adding the metal and shaking the crucible a little did the job. A little bit of heating later, and the alloy was liquid enough to cast.
Step back a little bit.
I poured it into a plaster mold I made earlier. Not super interesting, but here are some clips. Your boy, some plaster, and you put it into the water. I don't think many people are going to be looking for this.
Mixing technique.
Yeah.
Professional.
Grip.
It's much more viscous than it was before. Get a good angle, please.
Good angle. Alex, can you please explain what those clumps are?
Clumps are bits of plaster that don't have any water in them.
What are you doing now, Alex?
Trying to knock the air out of it. That should work. Thank you, art department, for not being totally worthless. Anyway, I poured the molten alloy into that. You may see the violent spitting. That's my bad for not preheating the mold. This wasn't ideal, but neither was it too big of a deal. Some material was lost, and the top of the cylinder wasn't the smoothest. Oh well. Once it had cooled, I cracked it open and had some things to say about it.
It's not bad.
A day after I cast it, the head of department and technician approached me, inquiring about the crucible I'd melted. What? The crucible I used was most likely steel or wrought iron, with melting points of 13 to 1500 degrees Celsius. Sure, the crucible didn't look well when I was smelting, but I would have been impressed if it had melted in my crappy, scraping 1100 degree furnace. Well, I found it, and it just had slag and uncast metal in it. Amazing. I whacked it against the anvil, the crap fell out, and I still have it. If you know what I can do with this, please tell me. It's really wasting space. Obviously, it wasn't a perfect cylinder. I mean, the pattern was wax cast in a poorly cut and glued kitchen roll. It wasn't going to be stunning. So the first step was to lathe one end into something the chuck could grip properly, so I could put that end in and round out the rest. Small problems. The lathe I used was stupidly loose, and I was really bad at lathing. I did end up changing to a slightly better lathe, but I was still crap at using it. Anyway, I eventually managed to make it somewhat round, and started cutting pulleys out of it.
It's probably good enough. It's just about to come off.
One down. And the end result was 4 surprisingly not god-awful copper alloy pulleys. Sure, a little off-centre, sure, a little rough around the edges, but on the whole, not terrible. I was able to implement 3 of them into my coursework project, with the last one, the first I'd cut, becoming a shelf ornament. See? So there, that's Camgirl.
Why did I call it that? Oh god.
Was it a good idea? Probably not. I was burned, cut, bored.
It works.
And frustrated at times.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
A lot of the times. Also, it was not the best use of my time. I had the rest of my coursework to do, which I put off until I completely finished this relatively small part of it. I wasted fuel, time, a lighter. Did I mention the lighter? I also burned through 3 cameramen, 2 of whom definitely had better things to be doing. But was it fun? Yeah. Did I enjoy it? More than I did casting pewter.
How do you feel?
I'm alright.
Will I use this poorly constructed furnace to melt copper again? Maybe.